So Shus Harav is listening here with us. So what we do is in Yaakov we go through the Agadot of the Gemara. We started the year off with Seder Kodshim, so Tvachim and Menachot. Now we're in the middle of Hullin.
That's great. You're going through the Yaakov on those Masechtas.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
We don't touch every Agadot, but the ones that that there's something interesting to say. So today we'll be discussing a sugya that connects to Gemara and Pesachim and also in Bava Batra, but our starting point is Hullin Daf Samach Gimel Amud Bet, and basically the pitch here is that here we have an approval from Chazal for the use of emojis. That the question that's bothering the Gemara is that if we look, the Kasher, we actually just read this past week, Parshat Shmini, discusses, you have the animals, you have the birds, and you have the fish, and it's recorded twice in Shmini and in Re'eh. So if we look in Parshat Re'eh, so for the animals, it gives a list of the animals that are okay, and for the birds, it gives a list of the birds that are not okay, that are tameh. And so the question that bothers the Gemara is why, when it's listing animals, does it list the be'emot teorot, but when it lists the birds, it lists the ofot hatmeot. It's inconsistent. So Chulin Samach Gimel Amud Bet. Tanya Rabbi Omer Galui ve'yadua lifnei mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam shebe'emat tmea meruba min hateorot lefikach mina katuv b'teora. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi teaches that it's known before HaKadosh Baruch Hu that there are more impure animals in the world than pure animals. Therefore, when the pasuk is listing out, it's going to list out the pure ones because there's less of them, so it's shorter. Similarly, Galui v'yadua lifnei mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam she'ofot teorin merubin al hatmein lefikach mina katuv b'tmein. And the flip side applies by the birds. There's more pure birds in the world than impure birds. So when it's listing out an explicit list, it lists the impure ones because there's less of them. Mai kamash malan. Why? Rav Huna dam Rav ve'amar le'amar Rav Huna amar Rav mishum Rabbi Meir לעולם ישנה adam לתלמידו דרך קצרה. Right, that if I have a choice between listing out a longer list of animals or a shorter list of animals, I'm going to go with the shorter list of animals, and that's a teaching in terms of how we should, just as the Hashem taught that way in the Torah, we should teach that way as well in our lives, as a good practice. So there's a lot of questions on that, and we'll see in Pesachim and Daf Gimel shortly kind of what's behind that. But first I want to raise something that actually maybe Rav can help us understand this, because I was actually not quite sure I understood this, but the question was so strong that I wanted to bring it anyway, even though I don't understand the answer. Manaf Yosef is one of the commentators in Yaakov. So he raises the following question. If you look in the screenshot there, where it says Galui v'yadua, in the bottom half of the screenshot, so he asks as follows on this Gemara. גלוי וידוע לפני מי שאמר והיה העולם שבהמה טמאה מרובה מן התורה שעופות טהורים מרובים מן הטמאים, and that's what we saw. קשה, this is difficult. בפרקת רבי אליעזר פרק כ"ג איתה ועד שלא בא המבול היו טמאים מרובים על הטהורים. So in פרקת רבי אליעזר, which goes through from Briat HaOlam and goes through kind of a history with all this midrashic embellishment. So in the parak that discusses the flood, it says before the flood there were more in terms of animals, there were more impure animals than pure animals. רצה הקדוש ברוך הוא להרבות את הטהורים ולמעט את הטמאים.
Talking about the species or physical number of how many are alive?
Okay, so that might be his answer, which I didn't understand. So maybe your question is mechaven to his answer. You'll tell me which one he means. but the Midrash is talking about there's more. I think that in general, I think on the broad level of animals, there's more impure animals than pure animals, and Hashem wanted to swap that. קרא לנוח ואמר לו, הבא לך לטבע מכל בהמה תורה שבעה מכל בהמה טמאה שניים. Right? We're familiar with the fact that when Hashem asks Noach to bring the animals, so he's supposed to bring 7 of the pure ones and 2 of the impure ones. And everyone asks, what's the concept of Torah and Tamea in the days of Noach? That's not a topic for now, but that Hashem asks Noach to bring more of the בהמות הטהורות. ורוצה לומר, כשיצאו מן הטבע, יהיו כל אבות הטהורים 7 ואבות הטמאים 2. That after the flood, because Noach is saving more Torot than Tameot, there will be more Torot in the world than Tameot of Behemot. וממילא יהיו הטהורים רבים על הטמאים, and therefore there will be more pure than impure. נמצא שאחר המבול ובשעת נתינת התורה, בהמות טהורים יותר מן הטמאים לפי דעת פרקת רבי אליעזר. So he says, therefore, according to this midrash, so after the flood, you had a ratio of 7 to 2, let's say. There's a lot more pure animals than impure animals. and just based on their procreation, so you go to Matan Torah, and at Matan Torah you'd also have more pure animals than impure animals. So why is that interesting? Because that seems to contradict what we just saw in the Gemara in Hullin. Because the Gemara in Hullin, according to Rebbe, said, when it comes to animals, there's more impure animals than pure. So the Torah listed out the pure to be der Ctzara. But according to this, if there were more behemot teorot brought onto the ark and saved, you'd think there's more pure animals than impure animals. So how do I understand the contradiction between those? That's the question. The answer, v'lo yadati mai kasher. So the Anaf Yosef is quoting this sefer, the Gvul Binyamin. I don't know who that is. But he's saying, I don't know why he has a hard time with this. The Gemara mari b'min shebeminim, sheba behemot teorim, muatim min atmeim. ובעופות המינים הטהורים מרובים על הטמאים, אבל פיקד רבי אליעזר ארי שכל מין ומין מן הטמאים היו מרובים בכמות מן המינים הטהורים. So, I don't quite understand, but the Gemara, he says the Gemara is referring to the shemin b'beminim. I think that means all animals, that in general there's more pure animals than impure, there's less pure animals than impure animals, because the Gemara says in general, be'emot temeot are murubot min ha'teorot. But Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer is dealing with each specific species. So it's saying, that, a pure animal, there's more Be'emat Torah of a specific animal in terms of numbers than of impure animals. It's unclear to me how that resolves the issue, though, because if I just add up all of the pure animals, if each individual pure animal there's more versus impure animals, but I add up all the... but it could be that
He's
there's...
saying they're not related, these two things.
Now that I said it out, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, because...
If you have a lot more pure animals
about how many
per animal, but there's a lot less pure animals than impure animals, you can still outweigh the total number of impure animals.
No, I think he's saying it doesn't make a difference how many of each animal there are. This is a separate... So this midrash that talks about, the ratio of 7 to 2 after the Mabul. That's how many animals there are. It's not about, he didn't wipe out certain species to make more species of kosher ones than non-kosher ones. The listing, when it talks about kosher animals versus non-kosher animals, it's talking about how many different species. So it lists the kosher ones because there's less of them.
Yeah, so there's less kosher species.
Than non-kosher species, in theory.
Right, but of the kosher ones, there's more
physical animals.
Physical animals.
They're not connected. It's two different things. One is a species, and one is...
Yeah, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's what he's saying.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
So which begs the question, what the original, as in why was it kosher for him? Because he says, I don't understand why it's a problem, but he had a problem with it.
The Gvul Binyamin.
Yeah. So
yeah.
He had a problem with it. So that's the question, what was his issue?
Maybe he assumed it was all quantitative.
Because if we take the 7 to 2 ratio, just for the sake of argument, okay? So it could be, right, for every Be'emat Torah, there's 7 compared to every Be'emat Tmeah, there's 2. But if there's 10 times as many Be'emot Tmeot, you'll have more Be'emot Tmeot overall. But each pure animal, there'll be more of those than an impure animal. Right? That's the answer. Why that was kasher for the Gvul Binyamin, right? Like the Rav said. He didn't think of it in those terms. Anyway, I think it's a fascinating kind of question. Okay. Good. Before we go to the Gemara in Pesachim, just to refresh our memory on something that it's going to piggyback off of, we've been talking here in the Anaf Yosef about the Be'emot, Teorot, Tmeot in the story of Noach. So let's look at the Psukim quickly. Vayomer Hashem leNoach, bo ata v'chol betcha al hateva, ki otcha raiti tzadik lefanai b'dor hazeh, mikol ha'be'ema ha'teora, tikach lecha shiva ish v'ishto, and these are the key phrases, okay? Umin ha'be'ema asher lo teora hi shnayim ish v'ishto. So take from the Be'ema Teora, 7, and take from the Be'ema Asher Lo Teora, 2. Okay, Vayvo Noach uvanav v'ishto, a few psukim later, Vayvo Noach uvanav v'ishto, v'neshev v'anav v'ito lateva, mipnei me'em abul, umin ha'be'ema Teora, umin ha'be'ema Asher enena Teora, umin ha'of v'chol asher omes al adama. So first it's Hashem's command to Noach, and then it's Noach fulfilling that command. The first time it says Be'ema Torah and Be'ema Asher Lo Torah, and the second time when Noach actually does it, it's Be'ema Torah, Be'ema Asher Enena Torah. That's going to become very relevant.
The difference between Lo and Enena?
Yes, but more fundamentally, why say Be'ema Torah and Be'ema Asher Enena Torah versus Be'ema Torah, Be'ema Tmeah? It's extra words. That's what the Gemara Pesachim is saying here. Okay, Damar B'Shua ben Levi. L'olam hayotzi adam davar meguneh mipiv. A person should always speak euphemistically. How do I know that? Shirei ikem hakatuv shmoneh otiyot v'lo hotzi davar meguneh mipiv. The pasuk goes out of its way to write the Torah Kedosha, right, from Hashem, the creator of the universe, uses 8 extra letters in order not to say something that is negative or impure. How do I know that? Shenemar min be'ema Torah min be'ema asher enena Torah. So instead of saying be'ema hatme'ah, which would be 5 letters, it says asher enena Torah, which is 13 letters. So 13 minus 5 gives me the shmone otiyot. Okay, Rav Papa Amar Tesha. Okay, Rav Papa brings one that's 9. Ravina Amar Eser. Ravina Amar Eser. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Sheshesrei. They bring, more and more psukim that have more and more words that seem to be extraneous, just to teach this idea. Tani deber Rabbi Yishmael L'olam yisaper adam b'lashon nekiyah. Okay, uveoraita mi laktiv tameh. What's the question on this whole teaching? What's the obvious question on this teaching? The Torah goes. It says tameh all over the Torah. Everywhere in the Torah, the word tameh comes up over and over and over again. So you're telling me it says be'ema asher inena Torah to teach me not to say tameh, but tameh is all over the Torah. Ela kol hecha dechi hadade ninhu mishtai b'lashon nikiyah. Kol hecha denefishin milei mishtai b'lashon ktzara. The Gemara says, welcome. The Gemara says every time the number of letters are similar, it will use the clean language. But any time doing that would really add a lot of extra letters, then the Torah is going to opt not to spill too much extra ink, and it will opt for the Lashon Ktzara, to speak with this short language, concisely. Which is what we learned in Hullin. So there's kind of this tension here between, on the one hand, trying to be concise and the value of being concise, while on the other hand, trying to speak euphemistically. And how far do I go out of my way to speak euphemistically at risk of not speaking concisely? That seems to be what the Gemara here is trying to balance. There's a few Mefarshim now, the Rif, the Maharsha, and the Yun Yaakov, that are going to answer a question that is fundamental here. We saw the psukim in Bereshit. Sorry, just before we turn the page, we had said there was a pasuk in pasuk bet where Hakadosh Baruch Hu commanded Noach, where it said Amina be'ema Torah mi'bema she'inena Torah, and then a few psukim later, Noach comes in. Noach does it. It says Amina be'ema Torah mi'bema she'inena Torah. Why does the Gemara use pasuk chet to teach? Why does Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi look at pasuk chet of be'ema she'inena Torah and say 8 letters? When it could have used pasuk bet, Hashem's original command, where it said umina be'ema asher lo teorah hi. It's the same idea. It's still ikem hakatuv. It's also letters that are extraneous, but the Gemara skips over the pasuk in pasuk bet and instead uses pasuk chet. Why does it do that? When it could have derived the exact same teaching. So if you look at the Rif in his commentary, he says as follows. In the screenshot, it says Ikem HaKatuv on the left side, on the first line. Piresh Rashi, Avagav de Beoret Aktiv Tameh, Shani Orche Bechad Duchta Lelamdecha Lechazer Achar Leshon Nikiyah. Okay, so he first says, Rashi explains here that even though it says Tameh, Rashi's comment on this particular line of the Gemara is that even though it says Tameh in the Torah many times, in this one spot, it goes out of its way to add extra letters in order to teach me this idea that you should speak euphemistically. And the Rif says, "Ve'ena akshot dezuhi kushat Gemara sheyikshu debereti lo ktiv tameh." Right? When we go back to the Gemara in Pesachim, there are dots here where we skipped further on in the sugya. The Gemara asks that question. The Gemara says, doesn't it say tameh all over the Torah? So Rashi in his commentary earlier, in his parish earlier in the sugya, says, but it says tameh all over the Torah except in this one place. But why is Rashi answering that if the Gemara itself asks that question later? Don't think that Rashi brought the Gemara's question of, doesn't it say tameh everywhere? And then he suggested his own answer of, here, it changed it in only one place to teach me this, versus the answer the Gemara gives later on. V'nira de kavanat Rashi zalhi le'akshot terutz haGemara. De'amar lehecha delav ki adad eininu mishtay leshon ktzara. Dim ken b'makom she'arich lomar inena Torah hi lo haya lo lomar tmeya leshon ktzara kevan debedaret achtiv tamei kadesh lo arich. Zeh tirat Rashi etc. I'm trying to see where... Okay, sorry. Yes. ולזה תירץ רש"י, דשני אורחי בחד דוכתא. לעולם דחה לחזר על לשון נקייה. ויש להקשות. Sorry, kind of the left column there. You can ask the question, לפי רש"י, שמצינו כתוב שתי פעמים בפרשת נוח. מן הבהמה אשר לא טהורה היא, וכתוב מן הבהמה אשר איננה טהורה, which is the question we raised. It says it one time right after the other, and why does the Gemara ask it on the second pasuk? Ve'amai shane orchei trei zimnei. Rashi says one time the Gemara goes out of its way to add these extra words, the extra 8 letters, but it should have said twice, because a few psukim earlier it does it as well. דחד הזימנה הם דבריו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, וצריך לפרש, מתכוון דחד הזימנה הם דבריו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, שאמר לנוח, ואין ללמוד מדבריו של הקדוש ברוך הוא לאורייתא בסיפורה של תורה. So the Rif is differentiating between, he's saying the reason the Gemara did not learn from the first pasuk, essentially this is the summary that I want to get to, because the first time he goes out of its way is because that's Hashem's command. The second time is Noach acting. And for some reason there seems to be some principle here where we don't learn from the words that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands about how, lessons about why the Torah uses extraneous letters. There's this concept here of אין ללמוד מדבריו של קדוש ברוך הוא לאורייתא בסיפורה של תורה. לכך חזר במעשה שספר לנו התורה, מן הבהמה אשר איננה טהורה, שניים בעל נוח. That's why it repeats itself and says Noach went and did it, and from that second one we derive it.
We can't derive the first one because it's Hashem speaking?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means, to be honest. But that's the chiluk he makes, where the difference between them is simply that the first one is Hashem speaking, the second one is the Torah in third person talking.
You'd think that if it was a lesson from Hashem, it'd be more of like a lesson, like the way Hashem talks, rather than the kind of quoting it.
Yeah. ואין ללמוד מדבר של הקדוש ברוך הוא לאורייתא בסיפורה של תורה. I guess that, yeah. I don't know.
I'd be assuming that sometimes the way that Hashem speaks, like when Hashem speaks directly to a person in the Torah, it's not like miduyak the same way that the anonymous narrative is.
Right.
Maybe because a person hears the nevuah in a way that's matim for them. I mean, he's not saying this, but maybe it's a dibra Torah kilashon b'nei adam type of thing. I'm not sure why that would be more kilashon b'nei adam to say the verbose formulation of asher lo teorah. I don't know. Maybe that's what the principle is based on.
Possibly. It's a good suggestion. So that's one answer to the question. The Yun Yaakov provides another answer. Back at the screenshot on the right side, on the top. It's not the Rif.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Right. I'm not sure who it is. It's some other commentary. It's ironic because the Rif, he stripped out all the Agadah and just saved the Halacha, and the Yun Yaakov did the opposite. And there's a commentary of the Rif on the Yun Yaakov.
Right. So. The Yaakov also, I think, is like 400 years after the Rif died, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
400
years.
Yaakov even Chabib in the 1500s.
1500s.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good question. I don't know who the Rif is. The Yun Yaakov is Rav Yaakov Reischer, who lived in the 18th century in Russia, I believe.
He was the Minchas Yaakov. Shus Yaakov.
Yeah.
I think.
Could be. It could be. He's my favorite parish that I've seen. Going through the Yun Yaakov, he always has a good insight. So here he says, Hadilo maiti mi pasuk akodem. So he asks the same question. Why didn't the Gemara derive it from the previous pasuk that Hashem said, Mina be'ema asher lo teorah hi, instead of Mina be'ema asher enena teorah? So he says, Ayin b'marasha ve'harif. So we'll see the marasha in a second. I'm leaving it for the last, but we just saw the Rif. Ve'od nira li lomar, מאותו פסוק אין ראיה, ואמר הקדוש ברוך הוא לנוח מן כל הבהמה. We can't derive it from the pasuk that Hashem said to נוח. תיקח לך, אין זה כבודו של נוח לטפל עצמו עם מין הטמא. וכך כתוב בלשון נקייה. אבל אחר כך שהתפלל נוח ולא היה יכול לקבצן, כדאית בפרק דרבי אליעזר, פרק ג' והוא בילקוט ראובני פרשת נוח, ובאו הכל מעליהן. ואפילו אחרי כתיב בלשון נקייה, שמע מינה אשר יוצא דבר מגונה מתוך פיו. What does he say? He says, when Hashem commands Noach, בהמה תורה בהמה אשר איננה תורה, Hashem is doing that to protect Noach's honor. because it wouldn't be ra'ui for Noach to go gather impure animals. So he says, go gather the pure animals and the animals that aren't pure. But then what ends up happening, according to other midrashim, is all the animals came on their own. Noach didn't have to go and shepherd them. So when the Torah, even after the animals came on their own, goes out of its way to say the pure animals and the animals that are not pure, so there it's redundant, and I can derive from that that a person should speak euphemistically. So the Yun Yaakov, he does this where he combines other midrashim to elucidate other midrashim. So it's a nice insight. Let's look now at the Maharsha, because that's, I think, the interesting one. And we'll get into also a bit more, something that maybe the Rav has something interesting to say on as well. So the Maharsha, first of all, quotes the Chizkuni. So first we have to look at the Chizkuni on the next page. Okay, so the Chizkuni in his commentary on these psukim in Noach says something that is a little bit startling. Umina be'ema asher enena teora. Mikan muchach b'psachim. Right, from this pasuk, the Gemara in Psachim derives, Ikem hakatuv shmoneh otiyot, and it says shmoneh otiyot explicitly in the Gemara, if you remember. And we calculated, instead of hatmea, it said asher enena Torah, it was 13 instead of 5, so that's 8 difference. V'lo tzid davar meguneh, dematzi lemema umina be'ema hatmea. And now the Chizkuni asks a question. Shari yesh lanu le'achiach kach mimikra shel mala, umina be'ema asher lo Torah hi. We should derive from the previous pasuk. V'nimtza ikum shmoneh otiyot. From that pasuk also we could say there were 8 extra letters. Okay, and then skip kind of what he says, ve'en taretz, etc., etc. And then on the second to last line, Ulefi Talmud tzarich tevat teora liot melea. Okay, the words asher einena teora, right? It's explicit that there's an 8-letter difference. So if you say it's replacing hatmea with asher einena teora, so the word teora has to be with the vav to get to a difference of 8. And the Chizkuni says lashnim shmoneh otiyot haikum. The problem is that in our Masorah, the word Torah here is spelled without a vav. If we look at the Minchas Shai in his commentary on this pasuk, he says, "Mashinim sar b'Masorah shelanu kan u'beresh malachi v'teilim yotet divrei shgaga hen ve'en nismoch alehen." Okay, there's some Masorah about whether the word Torah should be spelled with or without a vav, and that Masorah that is recorded here in Noach and in Malachi and in Tehillim, where the word Torah also comes up, Minchas Shai says that Masorah is mistaken. Shari manu kol tzipor Torah the Parshat Re'eh imam leim v'hu chaser bli safek, because that Masorah that he's referring to says that the phrase kol tzipor Torah is malay, and the Minchas Shai says that Torah is for sure chaser. So that particular tradition is not correct. Skip a little bit to where he says. Ve'amesorah nechona ve'yashara at the end of the third line. So the Minchas Shai says the correct Mesorah should say kach tzricha lomar tehora hey. The word tehora 5 times. Gimel chaser u'bet maleh. It should be missing a vav 3 times, and it should include a vav 2 times. V'siman asher lo tehora, asher enena tehora, kol tzipor tehora. Those 3 are the shalosh chaser. Okay, the first 2 are the 2 psukim in Noach that we just saw. Asher enena Torah, Asher lo Torah, he Asher enena Torah are the 2 times where HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands, and then Noach does it, and then Kol Tzipor Torah is in Parshat Re'eh. Those are the 3 chaser. Ulshmi mincha Tehora de Malachi, Yirat Hashem Tehora omedet la'ad. Those are the 2 in Malachi and Tehillim. Those are written malay instead of chaser. That's what the Minchas Shai says. B'tar milim chad l'Torah d'yin niktav nizozer ken matzati mesoret meduyakim v'chen hem b'sfarim meduyakim. What follows from this is the Minchas Shai says explicitly that the 2 instances of Torah in Parshat Noach should be written chaser, but the Gemara, you have to understand it, that it's written malay, in order to get to the Shmoneh Otiyot that it explicitly says is the gap between Atmeya and the Torah. Okay, so that's a question that the Chizkuni alludes to, even though he doesn't spell it out explicitly by saying the Torah should be written malaya. So we go back to the Maharsha. V'ikshah Chizkuni amai lo mai tikra del el minei beparsha zu di kem be nami chet otiyot tichtiv u'mina be'ema asher lo Torah hi. Okay, ad kan lishono. The Maharsha says a third answer to why HaKadosh Baruch Hu's asher lo Torah hi cannot be used to teach the Gemara's teaching. V'nei li Hashev, d'alkoch hine trei kra'e lo tzriche lemai demasik. דדווקא דחי הדדינין הוא משתאי בלשון נקייה, דכך יקם בחד קרא. I'll skip actually to the answer. So if you go to the third line from the bottom, where it says Kadam Rinan in the middle of the line, it says Aval, the third line from the top, the end of the line, Aval Idach. It says Aval Idach Kra Ati Lashmeinan Delo Yisaper Adam Bignut Be'ema Kadam Rinan Perichet Bava Batra. In other words, Maharsha's answer is we need the two psukim because the second one teaches me something completely different. I need that teaching to teach me something else, as is taught in Bava Batra. We'll read that inside in a second. So there's a teaching in Bava Batra which also kind of is based on the fact that it goes out of its way to say Asher lo Torahi. V'i lav try cry, and if I didn't have two psukim, one of Hashem's command and one of Noach doing it, lo havi alfinan hani bedrashot. I couldn't derive both what it says in Bava Batra and what it says here in Psachim. Dehatam lo yisaper adam afilu bignud be'emadada v'hach dehatam yisaper Hashem shonikia el echad minayu. I could only have derived one of them if I only have one pasuk. Aval mitoch shnei hamekomot nimedad drasha dehacha vehatam. But because it's mentioned twice, I can learn both of them. So we saw three answers to the question of why the Torah goes out of its way twice to add those extra 8 letters, but the Gemara in Psachim looks at the second one. The Harif said it was because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can't derive this sort of teaching from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's words, only from the narrative. Iyun Yaakov said it's because when Hashem commanded it, it was to preserve Noach's honor, and not say to him, you have to gather impure animals. And here the Masha says it's because we have two teachings from this same concept. One is to speak euphemistically, and another is from this Gemara Bava Batra, which we'll learn now. So I need two separate psukim. So each of them comes with their own kind of teruts on why the Gemara derives it from the second one. Just learn this Gemara in Bava Batra, and then kind of conclude on what the Chizkuni raised and what we saw in the Minchas Shai. So the Gemara in Bava Batra that Maharsha is alluding to has a nice gadata. So it says, so the Torah tells us that Leah's eyes were rakot, they were soft. What does that mean? So the Gemara says it can't be that when the Torah says Leah's eyes were rakot, and it means it in a derisive way that her eyes were not beautiful. It can't be that that's what the Torah was saying, because the Torah won't even say gnut be'ema tme'ah. How do I know that? Because it says umina be'ema asher einena te'ora. The Gemara, the Torah goes out of its way not to insult an impure animal, so for sure it's not going to say something derogatory about Leah imenu. Okay? Ella amar Rabbi Elazar shematnotea arukot. So rakot, it means that matnotea arukot. So it's not rakot ela arukot, long. Rav amar לעולם rakot mamash. Rav says no, it means rakot, that her eyes were soft or weak. Velo gnaihi. But so then how do I understand the Torah saying derogatory? It's not negative. It's actually a praise of Leah. How so? Ela sheva chula she'ayta shomat al parashat drachim bnei adam she'yomrim shnei banim yeshal Rivka shtei banot yeshal Lavan. So Rivka has 2 sons and Lavan has 2 daughters. And Leah heard people gossiping or talking about this. And they would say it makes sense for Lavan's oldest daughter to be wedded to Rivka's oldest son, and the younger to the younger. In other words, that Leah should marry Esav, and Yaakov should marry Rachel. And she would ask these people, Gadol mama asav, what is the older son like? Ishrahu milastem briot. He is wicked, he steals from people. Katan mama asav, what about the younger son? Ishtam yoshev olim. That's in the Torah, right? Yaakov was a bachar, an avrech. V'hayta bocha ad shenashru riseh einea. Right? And Leah would cry until her eyelashes fell out. She was so upset about having to marry Esav. And that's why einea rakot. It's not an insult to her physical beauty, it's a praise of her distress at being initially destined to marry Esav. V'hainu dichtiv vayar Hashem ki snua Leah. Eventually Hashem notes that Leah was hated, and he opens her womb. My snua, what does it mean that she was hated? Ilema snua mamash could you say that Leah was actually hated? The Torah wouldn't even though it's not an insult of Leah directly, just that other people hated her, the Torah would not say that. Because that's an indirect insult to Leah, that there might have been some reason for her to be hated. Chas v'chalila. What does it mean? Ki snu'a Leah? That Leah hated Esav's character. And that is why, Vayiftach et Rachma, and that's why he opened up her womb. So the Gemara there is teaching, I think, nice lessons about the idea of Leah and Rachel being both married to Yaakov, and the older and the younger, and what was motivating Lavan to play that trick. But the point here is that it's deriving the basis or the power of the Agadic exegesis here is based on the idea that there's those extra words in Hashem's command, in the command to Noach.
The whichever Mepharshim before was saying about we needed both separate psukim because one is used in Basra and then we need another time. The same lesson is already here. It's not like it's a completely separate lesson learned here. This Gemara is learning that lesson of the Chumash speaking nicely.
It's a bit different. It's the first lesson is to speak euphemistically, and the second one is to say not to insult impure animals. I hear what you're saying. You could say that those are nuanced, really the same idea. The Marashal goes out of his way to try to say that they're different, but I think it's a valid question. Yeah. I mean, I would just in honesty, I would pose a further question on the Marashal. Why can't we have two Haggadah teachings from the same pasuk? That happens all the time.
That happens all the time in Gemara, though.
Yeah.
Gemara often
Right.
say, but he learns it from there. So where does he learn it from? And there's like a whole. Each person can learn one thing from each pasuk. It's like a very.
I think
In halacha, we have that.
In halacha, yeah.
That we can always learn one.
But
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Right, I think
Not sure.
we've certainly seen examples of that where in the Shir where we derive multiple things. We're about to finish. We derive multiple things from the same pasuk. But the Marashal seems to have as a yesod, not just in halacha but also in Agada, that one pasuk, one drasha per pasuk, almost.
So what Masar did the Gemara people have?
Yeah. So right, to go back, I'll just kind of conclude with this. Right. So it seems unavoidable that the Masar that we have, or if we open up any of the Chumashim here, you'll have Torah, you'll have the Vav. But because the Gemara says Shmone Otiyot, you have to understand it to be with a Vav. I heard one of my Rebbeim while he was Rabbi Weider, who was a huge Talmud Chacham, and he gave it was actually related to the Haggadah, that he gives a shir where he says, everyone asked the question on the Chacham versus the Rasha. Right, the Chacham, he says, Ma edov v'chukim azim asher tzivah Hashem Eloheinu etchem. And then the Rasha says, Ma avodah azot lachem. And the answer we give to the Rasha is, he says, Lachem v'lo lo. He's excluding himself. Everyone says, but the Chacham said etchem. The Chacham also excluded himself. He said etchem. So why are we giving the Rasha a hard time and not the Chacham? So Weider in the Shir, he quoted 8 or 10 different answers from traditional Mefarshim. And then his final kind of conclusion was that if you look at, not in the Haggadah, but in the version in the Yerushalmi, and then also in the Septuagint, the Tzis scrolls, etc. So it actually doesn't say Etchem, it says, something like that. So he's not excluding himself. So Rav Weider says that the whole question falls away. He's not excluding himself. That's why you only have this on the Rasha. It raises a larger kind of question. And Rav Weider's answer to that was that he actually brings a whole bunch of examples similar to this one, where the Gemara says something and our Masorah says something different, and based on the teaching the Gemara extracts. And here we're lucky that it's Agarata. He brings examples that are halacha lemaisa, where it's based on an extra vav, and we don't have that. And he says that there's a lot of examples like this, and that there's Rishonim and Achronim who were aware of this and ascribed to this and acknowledged it, and that they didn't seem to have an issue with it as a concept. But I'll leave it at that.
The Chumash text we have is slightly different than the Gemara's had.
Seemingly.
Or you have to bend over. He said there's also Achronim. I forget who he quotes, but he says there's Achronim who take sugyas like this and try very hard to explain why we're misunderstanding it and that there isn't a difference. But I'll katonti on that. Just Here's an interesting example of that phenomenon. We'll leave it at that.
It's not halacha. My father told me once he found there's a word. I think it's a whole pasuk that's different in a Korean ketuvim. It's a different Masorah for it. I think it's a different hayamim. It's a whole pasuk. That he came across in his yeshiva, and he went to Rav Meidan. He asked me, "How could it be that we have a totally different pasuk in the Masorah?" So Rav Meidan said, "What do you mean? You should be asking me how is it that this is the only pasuk in the whole Tanakh that we have only two different versions? It's remarkable that over the course of the generations that it's been this close."
Yeah.
So one could say something
That's a good
similar
way.
about the vavs here, vav there.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Good
much better than
Shkoyach.
trying to explain it away in some
There's also something with Rashi, the Pilakshim of Keturah. There's something, or Kalos, Kalas. There's a few examples. There's examples.
Of differences in the.
Yeah. But that's a good one, right? I mean, it's miraculous to say that something that is so long is preserved so well. 100% is a huge Lishmaya, no matter what.
And in terms of the halacha, so the halacha at the end of the day is both the Masorah that we have in Sinai and also what Chazal have.
Usually
given us.
psukim are more of an asmachta, no? At the end, like the halachas were passed down or whatever, and they found psukim to rely on it. So that,
Right.
I don't know if there's any new halacha that actually comes from above.
The one Rav Weider gave is that in the beginning of Sanhedrin, Dalet, something about how many sprinklings you have to do on the Mizbeach, something to that effect. It says Kranot 3 times, Kranot, and 1 time it's with a Vav, and 2 times without a Vav. It teaches you the number of sprinklings that they have to do.
Okay.
And we have a different number of Vavs, something like that. I mean, it's halacha, not lamaisa, because it's about a Mizbeach, but it's definitely in that context. What I think to go back to the original idea, לעולם ישנה לתלמידו דרך קצרה, that in life, right, we have a balance between speaking. Yeah, there's a balance between speaking euphemistically and carefully versus speaking concisely, right? And how far out of our way do we have to go not to insult people, versus to make sure that we're careful, that we're kind of shortened to the point, and that you kind of. Could you stop this, Hullin? That you have you have both of these concepts here, and the interplay between them is interesting. But the idea of לעולם ישנה לתלמידו דרך קצרה is obviously just also in terms of a pedagogical tool that it's easier to kind of convey ideas if they're done concisely versus to ramble on.
Bullet points.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Shkoyach. Thank you very much.